customer service, done right, can be your company's single biggest competitive advantage. Welcome to the Customer Service Revolution. Join customer service authority and best-selling author John DiJulius as he interviews leaders who are revolutionizing their industries. This is more than a podcast, though. It's a movement. The Customer Service Revolution is a radical overthrow of conventional business mentality designed to transform what customers and employees experience. If you're a revolutionary customer service leader who's ready to stop competing on price and obsessed with building a brand that people cannot live without, this podcast is for you. Welcome to the Customer Service Revolution podcast with John DiJulius. This week, John talks with Marcus Engel. As a college freshman, Marcus was blinded and nearly killed after being struck by a drunk driver. Today, he's a sought-after motivational speaker and author that teaches the art of compassion and being present. In this episode, you'll learn how he endured 2 years of rehab, over 350 hours of reconstructive facial surgery, and adaptation through a multitude of life changes. You'll also learn what is a compassion expert, what the two most compassionate words are any human being can hear, what is the greatest gift we can give to another person, and what Marcus will be presenting about at the 2022 Customer Service Revolution Conference. Now here's your host, John DiJulius.
Hello, revolutionaries, and welcome to another episode of the Customer Service Revolution podcast. And today I'm thrilled to have a special guest, a speaker and author who has an unbelievable message. His name is Mr. Marcus Engel. Hello, Marcus.
Hey, John, how are you?
I am fantastic. Thanks for being here. I'm so excited to get our listeners to hear your message and give us your background story, Marcus. Where'd you grow up and what led you to becoming a speaker?
Wow. So I am a native of St. Louis, Missouri. I grew up in St. Louis until I was about 10 years old. In elementary school, my parents decided that they wanted to get back to their roots. And so they moved our family back to where both of my parents grew up, which is a rural farming community about an hour outside of St. Louis. And I grew up just a pretty typical red-blooded all-American kid. In high school, I did all the usual things of band and choir, National Honor Society, that kind of stuff. You know, played football. I always tell people it was like growing up in a John Cougar Mellencamp song with that whole small town mid-America thing. So, and then I guess what led me to speaking and what led to the work that I do specifically with healthcare professionals around the country came during my freshman year of college. I started at Missouri State University freshman year, and about 6 weeks into my freshman year, I went home for the weekend and went into St. Louis, went to a St. Louis Blues hockey game with some friends that Saturday night. And following that hockey game, there was an incident that happened that kind of changed the trajectory of my life from that point on.
So you're a few months into your freshman year of college, you come back home to visit, and you're leaving a Blues game or going to one?
Just going home after a Blues game. It was the season opener, and my friends and I had really good seats for it, and we were all excited. Just a bunch of 17 and 18-year-old kids out for a
Did they win?
Fun
Do you
night.
Remember if they won?
I do remember that they won. I don't remember what the score was, and I do remember that Brett Hull had a penalty shot in the game, which is a pretty exciting thing. First time I had been at a game with a penalty shot.
All right, so you're leaving the Blues game pumped up because they just won.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens next?
Friends and I are going to White Castle. Every 18-year-old who's a college student who has no money, their favorite food in the world, White Castle burgers. And my friends and I were going to White Castle, and as we were driving down a street called Hampton Avenue in St. Louis, we went through an intersection when we had a green light. And when we pulled out into that intersection, from my vantage point in the front passenger seat of that car, I looked off to my right-hand side out that side window, and the only thing I could see was a pair of headlights that were just seemingly inches from my face. And whenever I saw those headlights, I went into shock and I lost consciousness for about the next 10 or 15 seconds. And those lights were the last thing that I ever saw. The impact of that crash,
To
not
this
only
day, correct, Marcus?
to this day,
That's the last memory of vision you have is those headlights headed at you.
Bingo.
Ugh.
Headlights attached to a white car. That was the last thing that I ever saw for, however many years that's been now, nearly 30 years. So, yeah, but honestly, I tell people about being blinded in this vehicle crash. And while blindness is something that the majority of people cannot even fathom, right? Myself included, we're human beings, we're visual creatures. We take in something like 80% of our information through our visual means. And so to lose that is obviously a great loss. However, I was so injured in that crash that the whole idea of blindness really took a back seat.
Yeah.
Yeah, the actual loss of sight came because all of the bones in my face were crushed whenever I was thrown face first into the street.
So your life was in jeopardy?
Oh, yeah, my life was in jeopardy. In fact, there's a procedure that is done in medicine that's called a crike. That's the short name for it. And that is the last ditch effort to try to save human life. And at that time, all the bones in my face were so crushed from what is called a Lefort 3 fracture that the paramedics on the scene knew that my airways were being cut off, and they had to make an incision in my throat so that I would have an airway. That was all done in the middle of that intersection, just 3 miles away from a.
You're not even at the hospital yet.
Not even at the hospital, still in the intersection. They knew if they didn't do that right there in the intersection, I would not survive even that 3 miles to the hospital. Yeah.
All right. So what happens next? You go to the hospital. Are you out of the woods as far as living goes?
Sort of. Sort of. It was a bit touch and go that first night, as I think most all of the doctors will tell you. And I really only remember about two things from being in the emergency room that night. The first thing I remember was that somebody took a scissors and cut off all of my clothing. That was the first thing I remember. The second thing I remember was waking up, coming back into consciousness out of unconsciousness, whether that was shock or drug induced, whatever the case was. And I would, every once in a while, I would wake up, and the world that I came into was just obviously filled with pain and terror and darkness. And the only thing that gave me any kind of comfort in that world was the fact that there was someone who was holding on to my right hand. And the individual who held on to my right hand, every time this person could tell that I was conscious, she would say to me, she'd say, "Marcus, my name is Jennifer. You were in a car accident and you're in the hospital." And then I would squeeze her hand to let her know I recognized what she was saying. And then she would repeat what I think are the two most compassionate words that any human being can say to another. And those words are, "I'm here. I'm here." And so in this moment, I didn't even know where here was, but I knew that I was not alone at this extremely vulnerable moment in my life. I knew that I was not alone, that somebody was with me. And so my work really stems from that brief moment and that brief experience with Jennifer, reminding individuals that simple human presence is the greatest gift we can give another person. And I primarily do this with healthcare professionals across the country, but really it's not just human presence in healthcare in a medical setting. This is what we all can do for one another. Every one of us has had that experience of feeling vulnerable or afraid or in peril, and having another person who is there for us. And I just get to remind people that that's the greatest gift we can give another person.
You know, it's amazing, like what you went through. You were 17. I guess it wouldn't matter if you were 77, and you were fighting for your life. and I'm assuming or asking, then maybe when you realize you're no longer fighting to take your next breath, but now it comes to reality that you're never going to see again.
Yeah.
How does a 17-year-old not wallow and say, woe is me, and this is unfair, and all my friends and all what I envisioned of my future is not what it's going to be? How did you go through that?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. You say, how did I not wallow? I did wallow for a while. I think it's human, right? It's human. You lose something that's as precious as one's ability to function normally in the world. And you are going to have times of depression, and you are going to have times of extreme fear and wallowing, and just it's the dark night of the soul, right? It's the dark night of life for me, the rest of my life, dealing with blindness. And so I do remind people that, look, we have to accept our own humanity, right? Anybody who will tell you that they went through a life-changing experience and just walked out the other side happy and content without any kind of psychological residue, a lot of times I'll call that person a liar to their face, right? Because in this world, we know that to truly be human,
or Marcus, let me add, sorry, maybe they do think, but from my experience, and it doesn't compare with yours, they're not on the other side yet. Right. Yeah, they're faking it, or they're kidding themselves, but they have some reckoning coming.
Right. And again, that's probably an overstatement to say you're a liar. Maybe you're just a little self-deceived, because I don't think that we go through things without walking out of it with a change.
Right. And whether it's a car accident, a life-threatening injury, the pandemic, right. A divorce, loss, whatever that may mean.
Divorce, right.
And we think, oh, I got this. Just keep busy and don't think about it, and I'll be fine, right? But I'm sure I know that's not the answer.
It's not always the answer, but I do believe that starting with reality, right? Not being the eternal optimist nor the pessimist, but the realist. Look at what is real in reality. And for me, laying in that hospital bed, knowing that I was never going to see again, knowing that I had hundreds of hours of facial reconstructive surgery ahead of me, I had to wrestle a lot with, what am I going to do, right? What's next? And I really came to the realization that when so much in my life had been changed so drastically, I wanted to hold on to something from my previous life, right? And I realized that my need for an education had not been lost alongside with my sight. And so I made the commitment, laying in that hospital bed, that I was certainly changed, but I was going to try to pick up the pieces as best I could, get back into college, resume my education, and just try to live the best life that I could. Because what other choice do we have, right?
How quickly did you get back after it?
It took me 2 years of physical recovery.
It wasn't because you were procrastinating. I mean, you went through hundreds of hours of facial reconstructive surgery and just rehabilitation. I can't imagine what that must have been like. But the first chance you got, you re-enrolled.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that wasn't necessarily the easiest thing either, because that was a year of physical recovery. It was 6 months of living in Colorado, going to a rehabilitation program for blind adults. That was training with my first seeing eye dog in New Jersey. And then finally, almost 2 years after that crash, I was able to resume classes. And that's whenever I understood that the last couple of years had really been a physical journey to try to get back to college. Then the real journey became, okay, how do you find happiness and contentment and purpose in this world that has been changed forever? How do you do that? That was where I had to walk that out for the next several years.
So Marcus, going in to college, what was your major going to be?
Going into college, I had the typical freshman major of undecided.
Parties and that.
Parties and girls, and I was taking my prerequisites and all those kind of things.
And so obviously this accident, this trauma changed that course, I believe, and you chose narrative medicine, which I'm not even sure what that is.
Yeah. So, well, narrative medicine is actually my master's work. I
Yes.
went back to whenever I was in undergrad, I got my degree in sociology because I really love people and I love
Okay.
studying people and how groups interact and work together and work outside of each other. I always found human interaction really fascinating. Then about 10 years after college graduation, I decided that I wanted to do something that would behoove my speaking and writing that I was already doing around the country. And I got accepted into a narrative medicine program at Columbia University in New York. And people say narrative medicine sounds interesting. What is it? Well, what we do in narrative medicine, it's really a combination of medicine and literature and philosophy and social work, all coming down to what can those who work in a clinical profession, what can we do with these incredibly difficult stories that you come across every day in healthcare, right? If you're a doctor or a nurse and you are persistently witnessing so much human suffering, what we do in narrative medicine is try to give you a framework that you can work out some of those things through. And that's
So, Marcus, I call it empathy fatigue. Would that be the same thing?
Yeah, you're talking empathy fatigue, compassion fatigue,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean,
Those
because like, in my life, I may come across hearing someone has cancer once in a great while. I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And but when you work in oncology and everyone you're dealing with today, every customer you come in contact with, I mean, I just couldn't imagine being able to reset myself every time and bring that. So that's what you're speaking of in a way, right?
Yeah, yeah. And those are the heroes that can do that every
Oh
day.
my God.
I wasn't meant to take care of people at the bedside. That's not my gift. But those who are nurses and doctors and physical therapists, occupational therapists, those are the people that I just have such admiration for because they do this work every day, witnessing that human suffering and still coming back the next day to do it all over again.
And so you mentioned as you were going for your master's, you were speaking. Now, how did you jump into that lane? When did you become a sought after speaker?
Well, I tell you what, I actually started speaking while I was 22, 23 years old, still in college.
Yeah.
I was running my speaking business out of my room in my college fraternity house, which is potentially the only legitimate business that's ever been run out of a college fraternity house.
Yeah.
But I started speaking after I graduated. And primarily, I guess one of the aspects that I did not share about this crash that took my sight was that the car that struck my friends and I was driven by a driver that had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.17. That's more than twice the legal limit. He was doing roughly 20, 30 miles an hour over the speed limit. So whenever I started speaking originally, it was to young people, it was to college students and high school students, trying to get them to just, hey, don't make a dumb mistake on a Friday or Saturday night. Don't put yourself in a hospital bed. Don't put your family through what I went through. Be smart, right? Just
you were trying to help raise more awareness for drinking and driving and what could happen as a result.
Bingo. Yeah, and also the overcoming adversity, right? Because every high schooler's got drama. Every person's got drama, really.
Right.
So what do you do when life kicks you in the teeth? And what do you do when you've got a major life change? How do you come back from that? But about 10 or 12 years ago, I started focusing so much on healthcare because I realized there are a lot of people who can talk about prevention. We still lose 10 to 20,000 people a year in America to a completely preventable crime of DWI. Where I saw that I had some expertise that was unique was I had spent a lot of time at the other end of the stethoscope, spent a lot of time in a hospital bed, and I was able to study those interactions by the doctors and nurses and PTs and OTs, et cetera, and really understand who were the ones that made me feel comforted, who were the ones that gave me their presence. And ultimately that presence is compassion. Right? Ultimately, that presence is compassion. And I wanted to be able to break that down so that if anybody else suffered like I had to suffer in the hospital, they would at least have well-trained clinicians that would be there to take care of their not only their physical needs, but their mental and emotional needs too.
Did some of that, Marcus, come from also the opposite that you may have experienced?
Certainly,
Yeah.
right? We can learn just as much from
Right.
negative experiences as positive. And yes, I do have a couple of really, really negative experiences of hospitalizations where my autonomy was not respected. My desires, my wishes, my wants and needs to be treated as a human being were not expected. I think we've all heard about the factory that healthcare can be, right? We feel like we're just going through a factory. My goal is so that people don't feel like they're going through a factory.
No, and we work with healthcare systems too, and probably not at the level that you do, but I know, and God bless them. I mean, I couldn't do what they do, but I know, like any business, they are guilty of transactionalizing their customer, meaning, hey, 201B needs his, and 201B is my brother, is my father. And I'm not criticizing them. It's just, we try to help them remember it's not 201B, a room number in a bed, or the, whatever it might be, the appendix in 201B, right? There's a name, there's a person there, and all businesses, we can be guilty of it. And that's where it goes back to that empathy fatigue, where you could just get, transactional at no fault of their own. But yeah, I'm sure you saw both. And so it sounds like you took both from your positive and, life-changing experiences and ones that maybe missed, and you've put something together that has really put you on the map for the person who brings this to the healthcare industry and others.
I hope that there's some macro level changes that get made, but really, I kind of go back to, I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson to say that success is to know that even one life is breathed easier. And I love that quote, because I know that when I'm speaking at nursing conferences or medical conventions or hospitals around the country, even long-term care facilities, I know that those who are on the quote unquote front line, or those who are at the bedside, are getting some extra vocabulary, how to communicate with people more compassionately. And if those patients in the beds are feeling that compassion from their caregivers, that's the whole point of my work.
Yeah. And listen, that's why we are bringing you in to keynote the 2022 Customer Service Revolution this fall, November 8th and 9th. And probably 10%, if that is, of our attendees are from the healthcare. But this is something that every industry, every human being needs to lead with and be human first and a professional second. And your message is just so critical.
If you like the Customer Service Revolution podcast, you're going to love the Customer Service Revolution Conference. It's 2 full days of world-class speakers, thought leaders, and brand executives sharing the best practices to become a revolutionary industry leader. Get tickets now to join us live in Cleveland, November 7th and 8th. Visit customerservicerevolution.com to register today.
God, there's so many different things. I want to ask you, Marcus, there's a quote I've always liked, and I'd like to get your expertise on it. Life doesn't happen to you, it happens for you. And that's easy for me to say because I haven't been put through what you've been put through. But does that work for you? Is that true?
Yeah, I love that idea, because it's a mindset quote, right? It's a mindset that we think that life is happening for us. And I know that many people would hear of my situation, they'd hear of my loss and this trauma and, years of rehab and recovery, and they would immediately feel sorrow or pity for my situation.
Poor guy.
Yeah, poor guy. And I sit there thinking, I can understand that, right? Because prior to me losing my sight, I had never met anybody who was blind, didn't know anybody who had been through that kind of life trauma, et cetera. So I wouldn't have had any idea. But I come back to the idea of you never know how much you can go through until you have to go through it.
Yeah.
You never know how strong you are until you have to go through it. And so whenever you talk about that mindset of life doesn't happen to you, it happens for you, I sit there often and try to keep myself in that mindset of gratitude. I have so many experiences and life experiences that I never would have had this not happened, right? A couple of years ago, I got to keynote for a big nursing conference at the UN in New York City with all of these wonderful nurses from around the world that are doing true missionary work, right? They're out in the field saving people from malaria and the AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. These are true heroes. I wouldn't have had that opportunity had this not happened to me.
Yeah.
So while it's an experience I would not want to relive, I have to have a certain amount of gratitude in my heart because I've got a great life, right? I've got a life today that I never could have having imagined, even especially not without sight.
So Marcus, let's talk about how this relates to typical days, right? I get stuck in traffic. I'm 15 minutes late for that damn meeting. Or it certainly could be a lot more serious, but it could also pale in comparison to what you went through, what a lot of people go through. What is it? What is your expertise on how people can deal with these stressful, sometimes unavoidable situations that may arise? What do you do? What do you tell them? What do you tell your audiences?
Yeah, well, one of the stories that I often share comes from when I was 16 years old. I lost my sight at 18, and whenever I was 16, I was just going into my I guess junior year of high school. And one day after football practice, I happened to come out of the locker room and I jumped in my car and threw my backpack in the back seat and put my car in reverse and didn't look where I was going and smacked right into another vehicle. It was my first fender bender when I was 16. And I jumped out of the car, looked at the car that I had just hit, and realized that the car that I had just hit was a brand new sports car that was owned by my high school principal and driven by my high school principal's wife with his toddler in the back seat. Now, no one was hurt, but you can imagine being 16 years old and causing thousands of dollars of damage to your principal's car. And my principal was such a wonderfully compassionate, empathetic person. He sat me down in his office and he says, Marcus, there's so many things in it. He said, as you get a little further along in life, you're going to learn that there are so many things in this world that you can't change. This is just one of those things that can be changed, right? We can repair a car. He said, change the things you can and don't worry about the rest because there's nothing you can do about those things anyway.
Wow, what a great advice. Yeah. Especially coming in a situation where, you smash into my sports car, what are you doing? You got to pay attention. My kid was in the car. And what a great way he handled that, and something that you needed to hear at that time, but you didn't know why.
And that was the advice that I came back to laying in that hospital bed. Change the things you can. What can I change in this situation? Well, very little, right? I can't do plastic surgery on myself. I can't do physical and occupational therapy on myself. But the one thing that I still had control over was what goes on up in my head, right? How do I perceive this? What's my attitude going to be? And I realized change the things you can means change your attitude too. And that was the time whenever I started saying, look, I've still got a life. I've still got a brain in my skull. And let's try to use this life that I have for good and to try to make somebody else's life easier.
That's awesome. Did you ever get a chance to tell the principal that story? And
absolutely.
That's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, every time I go back to Missouri, I try to have breakfast.
How cool. That's so cool. And which is the title of your presentation at the Customer Service Revolution, Change the Things You Can. So Marcus, now you're all over the globe sharing your message, sharing your expertise and your life story. And tell us what a compassion expert is, and how can I be a compassion expert if I'm not in healthcare, right? I'm assuming I can be one as a father. I'm assuming I can be one as a professional. Tell us what that looks like.
To me, being a compassion expert just means having the ability to stop and look around and be mindfully aware of everything. Right. So the last several years I've been teaching at Notre Dame, and I get to teach pre-medical students. So these are students who are going to be doctors several years down the road. They're 22-year-old kids right now doing all their organic chemistry and biomedical science, et cetera. And what I try to instill in their minds is to just slow down, right? Slow down, to pause, to be present. And so the definition that we use for compassion is witnessing suffering, being moved by that suffering, and then actually doing something to help ease another's suffering. And whenever we do that, even if we're sitting on the floor and the child is having a tantrum, maybe we can sit there and be present for that child in their tantrum. We can do that with our friends. We certainly do that with our customers and our clients, right? That's what it all comes down to, is trying to anticipate what are the difficulties, what are the pain points in these people's lives, and then helping to ease those pain points.
Yeah, I love that. One of my favorite phrases that I actually have on all my emails is carpe momento. All right, seize the moment. And, our focus must be on providing a positive experience in every interaction. And to what you're saying here, we don't know all the time when someone's struggling, right? But just being kind can help them, escape it for a moment. But then there also has to be an opportunity, especially with the whole pandemic, we've lost those innocuous Keurig conversations to find out how your weekend was, and I didn't know your mother was sick, or whatever that may look like. And that's really hard. We have to find ways to replicate that, so we can show vulnerability to be able to receive it and show people. So I love what you're doing. You've written multiple books, and in our show notes, we're going to have Marcus's website and a link to his book, I'm Here. Tell us about that book, Marcus.
Sure. So I'm Here is a nice little short 125-page book that was based on that experience that I had in the emergency department, where Jennifer held my hand and said, I'm here. The subtitle of I'm Here is Compassionate Communication in Patient Care. One of the greatest compliments I get on the book is when somebody comes up to me and says, Marcus, I'm in administration in an insurance office, or I work in corporate America. I don't have anything to do with healthcare, but I learned new ways that I can compassionately communicate with my employees, with my colleagues, with my clients, with my customers. And so even if you're not in healthcare, I think that you can get a lot from I'm Here, compassionate communication and healthcare.
Marcus, this is why our mutual friend Shep Hyken recommended you for the Customer Service Revolution. You are, one of the leading speakers in healthcare, and I think you're about to break out to all industries, because this is not a healthcare specific topic. In the world we're living in today, we need to have compassion. We need to be there for people. That greatest gift that you talk about, these are all so vital. So as the leaders there listening, what are some other takeaways? And you've given us a ton, that when they come and hear you speak at the Customer Service Revolution this November in Cleveland, what are some other things you might be sharing with them?
Boy, one of the things that I often remind people of is just how much of the world is suffering. And you mentioned the pandemic a while ago. Right now, the rates of ER visits are up significantly. Violence across our society is up. Child abuse is up. Domestic violence is up. Everything is up in the negative categories. And I think that the only way that we can start to combat some of these ills in our society is by practicing more compassion. And so I remind people that universal truth that I actually learned whenever I was a 18-year-old going through my first experiences being with a counselor, being with a therapist, where he said some words to me that I try to instill across the country to healthcare professionals, and that is this: hurting people hurt people. Hurting people hurt people. And when you're in customer service, you're going to be dealing with people who are hurting, right? They're customers, and if their order gets messed up, if whatever they're expecting gets messed up, that's where we have to understand from that person's perspective, right? That empathy, that compassion, to be able to look at their perspective, understand why they're upset, and then to work towards easing that pain and suffering. Just reminding us inherently that as human beings, we're all suffering. And so what can we do in our little niche, right? In our little corner of the world, is make these micro adjustments of kindness, of compassion, of perspective, of forgiveness. I think that what I'm talking about here, this is not rocket science, right? This is just human beings being human beings to other human beings.
I love what you said, and it's so true. And we talk about it all the time. When a customer lays into you, 9 times out of 10, it has nothing to do with just, what happened. Or, if you try to measure, well, I inconvenienced him 5 minutes, but he's acting like, it usually doesn't equate. And it's usually, that's not the reason. It was the tipping point of everything else that was going on in his life up until that moment that you just became a punch bag. So it's so important not to take it personally, but make it personal. And I've even seen myself, over the past 2 years, where I've left a business or hung up the phone and just couldn't believe how I snapped at that person. And for the same reason, whatever the situation was, I wish it could have been better, but it didn't call for maybe how I, laid into that person. And it had more to do with other stuff than that one incident.
That's where we bring in self-compassion, right? Because we're all human. We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to have a reaction instead of a response at some point in time, like you said. And we do have to come back with self-compassion of that's what I did, but that's not who I am. I am not a snappy person. I'm not a mean and belligerent person. And we've got to also practice that self-forgiveness and that self-compassion too.
Yeah. Well, listen, Marcus, I am so excited. One of my gifts, I can already tell, is that I got introduced to you. I am so excited to be able to share your talent, experience, story with all our revolutionaries that will be attending. Thank you so much for being our guest today on the Customer Service Revolution podcast. And I am so excited for all of our revolutionaries to see you live this November at the Customer Service Revolution.
Yeah, I'm really excited about being there, John. Thank you for the opportunity to be on the show today.
Thank you. And thank you, revolutionaries, for another episode of the Customer Service Revolution podcast. And we will see you next week.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to give the Customer Service Revolution podcast a thumbs up and write us a review. To hear more episodes, subscribe now on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Thanks for listening and for being part of the Customer Service Revolution.